Welcome, 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 everyone, to The Deep Dive. I'm your host, Penai.
And I'm Jonky. Great to be here.
It's great to have you. You know, folks, it's so easy to just skim the headlines, especially with international conflicts. One day you hear a war is over, a situation resolved. But what if the real story, the stuff happening behind the scenes, is, well, completely different? Maybe even startlingly so.
Yeah, it often is. The gap between the public narrative and the ground truth can be pretty vast.
Absolutely. And today we are diving deep into a really critical topic. This ongoing tension, this conflict between Israel and Iran, and where the U.S. fits into all of it. We're going to unpack some truly eye-opening insights from Colonel Doug Macgregor, things he shared in his latest interview.
And believe me, he challenges a lot of what we've been hearing.
He really does. It forces you to kind of step back and reconsider everything.
Exactly. And that's our goal today, isn't it? To help you sift through those layers. It's fascinating how declarations of, success or an end to conflict can be so different from the messy reality.
Messy is a good word for it.
We want to understand not just what Colonel Macgregor is saying happened, but why his view is so profoundly different from, let's say, the official story. It's about getting past those quick headlines.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Macgregor, he really comes out swinging, doesn't he? He just flat out dismantles this whole idea that the fight between Israel and Iran is over.
Oh, completely. No punches pulled.
Right. He says, and this is pretty direct, that for a president to claim the war ended, especially saying something like, the war ended actually when we hit the various nuclear sites, well, he calls that very, very ill-advised.
Yeah.
What's the core of his argument there? Why is that so dangerous in his view?
Well, his point is crystal clear. He believes we're not seeing the end of something. We're actually at the start of a much longer period of conflict. That's his framing.
Oh, wow, okay. The exact opposite.
Precisely. And he sees making that it's over claim as this huge gamble. He uses this analogy like walking out on the very edge and trying to jump across the chasm on the assumption that you're going to make it in one leap.
That paints a picture. Very risky.
Incredibly risky. It suggests, from his perspective, a real misunderstanding of just how deep these tensions run, and where this whole thing might actually be headed long term.
And his critique, it goes even further. He seems really skeptical about the whole official story. He calls the president's account of what went down very confusing and incoherent. And maybe most importantly, he says it's not true.
Yeah, not true. That's a heavy statement.
It really is, especially coming from someone with his military background. I mean, what are the implications? If the official story isn't true, then what actually happened?
Exactly. And that leads us straight into the really explosive part of his analysis, the claim about striking Iran's nuclear program.
Right, the supposed big hit.
Macgregor just dismisses it. He calls the idea that the U.S. destroyed the nuclear development capability. Well, he calls it nonsense. Just straight up nonsense.
Okay, so not buying the hype.
Not at all. He points out that maybe some media, he calls it boomer TV, might be pushing this narrative of complete success, obliteration, that everything went perfectly, but he insists the reality is just starkly different.
And it sounds like there was a coordinated message pushing that success story. Macgregor mentions figures like Widoff, Marco Rubio, Heath. Apparently they were all hammering home that narrative of success.
Right, giving all these intricate details about how it supposedly unfolded the great success that they had.
Makes it sound very convincing.
Sure. But this is where Macgregor throws a real wrench in the works. He contrasts that official line with what U.S. intelligence apparently indicated before the strike.
Okay.
The intel suggested Iran wasn't able to move any sensitive material out. The thinking was, we think we hit them so hard and so fast. These are supposed to be deep underground sites. Moving that stuff is incredibly hard.
Right. Makes sense. Difficult to just pack up and leave.
Exactly. But here's the bombshell from Macgregor. His counterpoint is that those sites were already effectively empty before the strikes even happened.
Wait, empty?
Empty. And this isn't some minor detail. This fundamentally challenges the entire reason for the strike, doesn't it? If the targets were empty, what was the point?
So what does that imply? If they were empty, how?
Well, that's the unsettling part. It points to 3 possibilities, and none of them are particularly comforting.
Okay, let's hear them.
Possibility 1. Iranian counterintelligence is way better than we thought. Maybe they got wind of it. Macgregor mentions that 2 hours notice they supposedly had and managed an incredibly quick, clean evacuation of critical material.
Which would be impressive and worrying.
Very. Possibility 2, U.S. intelligence was just wrong, either fundamentally flawed in its assessment of what was there to begin with, or maybe blindsided by Iranian deception.
Also not great.
Not great at all. And then there's possibility 3, which is maybe the most cynical, that the intelligence wasn't flawed, but it was ignored, maybe deliberately overlooked because it didn't fit the desired narrative or the political goals of the operation.
So the strike might not have even been about destroying capabilities, maybe more about sending a message, a display.
That's certainly what Macgregor seems to imply. It forces you to question the whole premise. Was it a genuine military objective or something else?
And this connects to another point Macgregor makes about President Trump having this habit, as he puts it, of kind of waving away information that doesn't fit his agenda.
Right.
He suggests Trump might have just decided to run with whatever the Israelis provided, maybe through people in the White House, instead of listening to his own intel agencies. What does that do to the national security process if a leader prefers outside advice over their own experts?
Well, it's a huge concern, obviously. Macgregor says he finds it not surprising, actually, and he immediately draws a parallel to LBJ.
Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah, apparently Johnson was known for doing something similar, especially regarding Vietnam, ignoring intelligence that didn't match what he wanted to hear or do. So Macgregor sees a pattern here. It's not just a one-off. It's how some leaders operate when politics or personal beliefs clash with intelligence assessments.
Which can lead to policies based on shaky ground, I guess.
Definitely. Policies based on assumptions, not reality.
But then Macgregor brings up this really interesting counterexample. Nixon and Kissinger. A totally different approach.
Yes. This is fascinating. He talks about how Nixon was given these really alarming CIA reports about Soviet nuclear strength reports that turned out to be pretty inaccurate.
Okay.
But Nixon didn't just accept it. He apparently said, let's check this. And Kissinger did something really smart.
What was that?
Instead of just reading the top-level reports, he actually brought the CIA station chiefs across Eastern Europe and in Central Asia straight to Washington.
The boots on the ground?
Exactly. The people who dealt with this every day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And guess what? Their assessment was completely different from the official CIA line coming out of Langley.
Wow.
Yeah. It was that real-world, unfiltered intelligence that was actually more accurate. And importantly, it led to policy changes, specifically the strategic arms limitation talks, SALT, a huge deal in the Cold War.
So it shows the value of digging deeper, challenging the bureaucracy?
Absolutely. It highlights this difference between potentially biased status quo intelligence and getting the raw data from the source. Leaders need to be willing to hear things that might contradict the official narrative.
And bringing it back to the present situation, Macgregor's take is that President Trump put a lot of trust and confidence in what the Mossad said. And that, in turn, was demoralizing his own team. He even mentioned someone like Tulsi Gabbard maybe pushing back initially, but eventually deciding it wasn't a hill for her to die on.
Yeah, it paints a picture of internal disagreement kind of getting smoothed over or maybe silenced by the president's preference. Important counterarguments might get lost.
That dynamic is really something. So let's shift to Israel's perspective here. What was their initial plan, according to Macgregor?
Well, he says the Israelis fully expected that Iran would collapse within the first 24 to 72 hours of their own initial strikes. That was the goal. A quick, decisive knockout blow.
High expectations.
Very high. But then something unexpected happened. An Israeli minister, Ben-Gvir, apparently admitted publicly what nobody in the Israeli government or anywhere in the Israeli media would admit.
Which was?
Basically, gosh, we underestimated the Iranian arsenal.
Whoa. A public admission like that.
Yeah. Huge. It completely undermines their initial confidence in planning, doesn't it? A massive miscalculation, admitted openly.
Absolutely. And Macgregor says that admission is what led Israel to immediately turn to the U.S. and ask them to bail us out.
Makes sense. Their plan A failed. They needed backup.
And he describes President Trump as wrestling with that.
Yeah.
Because, you had donor pressure pushing for action, but Trump himself wasn't keen on another war.
Right, that tension.
So what was the solution? Macgregor concludes Trump opted for something. Well, less than a full intervention. He calls it more of a PR stunt, a staged event, even political theater.
Political theater. That suggests it was more about appearances than actual military impact.
Exactly. And to back that up, Macgregor points to this absolutely crucial detail. The U.S. strikes were apparently announced before we went in.
Announced?
Yeah, he says the Iranians were told we were coming in 2 hours.
2 hours notice for an airstrike.
Right. And on top of that, there was apparently no pushback from from the integrated air defense systems, no missiles were fired from the Iranian side.
Okay, that really does sound choreographed. If you're trying to actually destroy something, you don't exactly phone ahead.
My thoughts exactly. It strongly supports that political theater idea. A managed escalation, not a real fight. But here's where Macgregor says the real danger lies. He argues the president is imputing to this a steady state outcome, basically acting like it's all wrapped up, problem solved.
When it's really not.
Not even close, according to Macgregor. He says the conflict could happen again tomorrow, it could break out in 6 weeks, it could break out in 2 months. His point is blunt. The war is not over.
Yeah.
He states flatly, Iran is still at war with Israel, and maybe, he suggests, increasingly with the whole Muslim world. So far from being resolved, it's actually incredibly volatile, like a lid on a boiling pot.
A very fragile situation. And that brings us to another critical piece Macgregor highlights, something often missed in the headlines, the actual state of U.S. military readiness.
The logistics, the nuts and bolts.
Exactly. He points out that the Israelis are reportedly running out of cash and missiles, and the U.S., we've been firing hundreds of missiles from our destroyers to support them.
That's a lot of firepower.
It is, and it has consequences. Our ships have to go back to port to reload. The paid missile defense battery on the ground has apparently had to fire virtually everything it has.
So we're burning through high-tech, expensive munitions at a rapid rate.
A very rapid rate. And they aren't easy or quick to replace.
And what's the bottleneck? Is it just cost or something else?
It's deeper than just cost. Macgregor mentions a Raytheon representative admitting a real problem with rocket motors. This affects crucial weapons like the Standard Missile 2 and 6.
Rocket motors, the core component.
The core component. So it's not just about having enough missiles assembled. It's about the underlying industrial capacity to build the parts needed for more missiles.
Which points to a supply chain issue, manufacturing issue.
Precisely. And here's the kicker. Macgregor says the U.S. doesn't actually make these critical rocket motors domestically. We're dependent on external sources.
Really? For key military hardware?
That's what he asserts. And he contrasts this with U.S. missile production numbers only increasing slightly from maybe 600 to 660 a year. He says flat out, this is not going to work if the U.S. wants to maintain its position as a great power or superpower.
Wow. That's a fundamental weakness.
It really is. It suggests a serious vulnerability in the U.S. military-industrial base, one that could really limit our ability to sustain operations or respond effectively in the future. It's not just a temporary shortage, it's potentially systemic.
And he draws a stark comparison, right?
He does. He says this dependency, this production bottleneck, is something the Russians and the Chinese don't have a problem with. We've got a serious problem with it.
Oof. That suggests this isn't just about Israel and Iran. It's about America's overall standing and capability versus potential rivals, a real potential Achilles heel.
Definitely puts things in a different perspective.
So wrapping this all up, what does this mean for you listening right now? Colonel Macgregor, he paints this picture that's just radically different from the mainstream narrative, doesn't he? A conflict that's only just begun, not finished. Actions potentially based on questionable intelligence or maybe even political theater. And underneath it all, a U.S. military perhaps facing serious readiness and industrial-based challenges. It's sobering.
It really is. And connecting it to the bigger picture, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How do we, as citizens, as consumers of news, actually process information about these incredibly complex global events?
Yeah, are we getting the real story?
Or are we sometimes just seeing the performance? That political theater Macgregor talks about may be designed more to shape our perception than reflect reality. It just underscores how vital critical thinking is. You can't just take the first headline you see at face value.
Absolutely. This deep dive, I think, has really starkly shown that contrast between an official narrative and a critical, very informed perspective from someone like Macgregor. Lots of layers there.
So maybe something for you to think about. In this age of instant news, declarations flying left and right, how do you try to verify what you're being told? And maybe more profoundly, how does understanding these behind-the-scenes logistical and manufacturing challenges, the stuff about rocket motors and production lines, how does that change your view of international power? Who really holds the cards?
Definitely something to mull over. Lots to think about there.
Until our next deep dive, anyway.
Indeed. And hey, if you found this conversation insightful, if it made you think, please do us a favor. Hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to the Geopolitics Gazette YouTube channel.
Yep, your support really helps us keep digging into these important stories.
It absolutely does. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.